We got Gators breakdown here. We know we're business.
Gators breakdown, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on social media at GatorDave_SEC, coming at you on a Tuesday night, not going live on Monday night because of the national championship game. Here we are on a Tuesday. Co-host Will Miles at Will Miles SEC and Read and Reaction. Will, we say goodbye to the 2024 season in late January for the first time. Ohio State takes down Notre Dame for the national championship. And, of course, even started trickling out before the national championship game. The way too early rankings, and Florida finally finds themselves in those rankings there. We're going to go over a few of them and some other headlines from today as well. But, 2024 season officially over all the way now, and Ohio State takes the national championship.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's Brave New World, right? Going all the way to the end of January, and it feels weird. And honestly, I had sort of forgotten the game was on until like Sunday night. And
I heard a lot of people say that.
Well, my kid asked, "Is there football on tomorrow?" And I'm like, "No." And I'm like, "Oh, wait a minute, there is a game on tomorrow." I mean, obviously, part of that is because Notre Dame and Ohio State are not exactly in our wheelhouse of teams that might play, but. You know, one of my concerns about all this stuff is that the restrictive college football playoff has always led to a lot of controversy, like all the way through any sort of playoff. Here we had the controversy with Alabama and Ole Miss and South Carolina and SMU and sort of who was in and who was out to start with. And then the controversy ends and it's just games, right? And at this point, by the time you get to Notre Dame, Ohio State, it was kind of rooting for Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany there, like that meme on Twitter, right? I mean, I don't know who I want to win that game, but I think we all know that Ohio State was the more talented team. And interestingly, if you go and look back at the 24/7 Sports composite, which is the compilation of talent, it did pretty well. If you'd have bet just using the composite in the playoff this year, you would have walked out with quite a bit of money. So, an interesting experiment. I think it'll be interesting to see what sort of tweaks they make. And hopefully we're talking about those tweaks in the frame of reference to the Florida Gators in 2025, because I think you and I both want and need a deep playoff run, along with all the folks who are listening to us.
Yeah. We've already discussed that, kind of our expectations for 25 and what would be good enough in a playoff run is that. And, hey, part of that is – maybe where you start in the rankings. And so we will get in these rankings. I'm going to share 5 of them. Look, there's a whole lot out there, but I share the ones from the major publications, and we're going to compare where Florida is to the schedule, their rivals, and kind of just throwing all those rankings together. Also, FanDuel come out today, and I tweeted it out, and boy, you guys did not disappoint with the 6.5 over-under win total from FanDuel set for the Gators. Gators winning 7 regular season games in 2024, 6.5 over-under set for the Gators by FanDuel. So, of course, that was a polarizing topic. And, of course, late last week, 24/7 Sports with a sit-down with Napier, and Napier pretty much confirming he's going to be the play caller next year. So, a loaded episode right here of Gators Breakdown. Lots to get into. That was another polarizing topic, of course. So, it's never
can't imagine why.
Yeah, for sure. Never a dull moment, and some really good conversations coming up here. So everybody hit that like button, subscribe right here on Gators Breakdown. But those likes and subs really help us out right there on the YouTube version, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform as well. And then Gators Breakdown Plus, if you want ad-free episodes of Gators Breakdown, and also talk with other Florida Gator fans out there, you can do so on the Gators Breakdown Plus Discord. Really, of course, these topics that we're discussing really hit hot and heavy on the Gators Breakdown Plus Discord today, the last few days, all that good stuff. So plenty to get into. If you want to have some more conversations right there, Gators Breakdown Plus, link is in the description. So, all right, Will, let's get to it. I'm going to throw all these up. And like I said, here's the major ones there. ESPN, Athlon, On3, 24/7, CBS Sports. ESPN, we'll start with them, of course, kind of the voice of sports right here. 18 are the Gators in ESPN's way too early 25 rankings. Key returning players: center Jake Slaughter, left tackle Austin Barber, quarterback DJ Lagway, running back Jaden Ball, running back Jacoby Jackson, wide receiver Eugene Wilson III, tight end Hayden Hanson, Defensive end Tyreek Sapp, defensive end George Gums Jr. Key losses, ESPN says, linebacker Shamar James, wide receiver Elijah Badger, wide receiver Chimere Dike, running back Montrell Johnson, defensive tackle Cam Jackson, quarterback Graham Mertz, punter Jeremy Crawshaw, cornerback Jason Marshall Jr. The 2025 outlook from ESPN, Florida coach Billy Napier likes to say that momentum matters in college football, and his Gators are carrying plenty into the offseason after closing 2024 with a 4-game winning streak. End of the season and bowl results can be fool's gold as well, so it might be a bit premature to get carried away about the Gators. More than anything, Florida fans should have hope after Lagway looked like a star in the making during the streak. The Gators will also bring back Ball, another impressive true freshman in 2024, and Slaughter, their All-American center. J. Michael Sturdivant transfers to help in a depleted receiver core. Napier also signed 2 4-star wideout recruits, Dallas Wilson, Vernell Brown III. The biggest concern, Florida will play one of the most difficult schedules in the FBS. And you can kind of see the rankings here if you're looking at the YouTube version of, Florida's schedule's filled again with ranked teams, by the way. And that goes on to what ESPN has to say. The Gators have home games against Texas, Georgia in Jacksonville, and Tennessee, and road contest at LSU, Miami, Texas A&M, and Ole Miss. Athlon had the Gators at number 14, a little bit higher than ESPN. They had to say the Gators seemed poised for a second straight. The Gators seemed poised for a second straight losing season, and Coach Billy Napier was all but fired after a 3-3 start. Said the Gators rallied behind Napier down the stretch, defeating LSU, Ole Miss, FSU, and Tulane to finish the 2024 campaign 8-5. A big reason for the late season surge was ultra-talented quarterback DJ Lagway's insertion into the lineup after starter Graham Mertz was lost for the year due to injury. Also, Florida's defense showed drastic improvement after surrendering 27.3 points a contest. In the team's first 4 matchups, the Gators did not allow more than 17 points in each of their final 4 games. The schedule was tough for Napier's squad once again in 25, but one of the nation's top quarterbacks under center, along with a roster that doesn't lose many significant contributors, contending for a spot in the playoff is within reach. Now let's go to On 3, who has the Gators the highest. On 3 has the Gators inside the top 10 at number 9. Andy Staples had to say there might be one quarterback as exciting as Sellers when they were referencing South Carolina as the team ranked ahead of Florida, and that's rising Gators sophomore DJ Lagway. Finished second in nations in yards per attempt last year and should improve in his accuracy with a full offseason as QB1. Meanwhile, the offensive and defensive lines that finished the season mauling potential playoff contenders will return intact. 24/7 Sports, Gators 13th. Billy Napier's hot finish to the Gators 2024 season means the Gators are hungry for more and a better start in 2025. They lost some key pieces on defense, but DJ Lagway, assuming the reins on offense, could make up for possible drop-off on the other side of the football. And then CBS Sports, also 18th, the same as ESPN, Dennis Dodd with his rankings here. He said, I said last year, if Billy Napier won 8 games, he should be in line for a raise. Well, after a surprising 8-win season, Napier seemingly has things squared away with star quarterback DJ Lagway in a full season ready to take over. What amounts to the game's toughest schedule switches venues from 24 with games at LSU, Miami, Texas A&M, Kentucky, and Ole Miss. So there you go. If you're looking at the YouTube version, you can see all the rankings. We'll let Will hop in here to see anything caught his ear here, and then we'll go into the other rankings and where other teams are ranked as well. But Will, certainly nothing surprising said by those analysts there from ESPN, Athlon, On 3, 24/7, CBS Sports. The Gators right here in these 5 rankings, a high of 9 on 3 and a low of 18 on CBS Sports and ESPN.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that there's obviously a lot of enthusiasm around the program. That enthusiasm starts with DJ Lagway, really maybe starts and finishes with DJ Lagway. And, I think the schedule part of it, and we'll certainly talk about that, is probably the thing that last year we all looked at and said, oh boy, like the schedule. I actually think this year is probably maybe a little bit more difficult than last year's, not necessarily because of the opponents on the schedule, though that's a big part of it, but also where the road games lie. And that'll be the question, I think, for Florida is, you think about sort of the opponents that they had just for this year in the last four. I mean, LSU's a home game. Ole Miss is a home game. FSU'd fallen apart, and Tulane's essentially a home game, right? So, and if you go back and look at where Lagway struggled, I mean, the places that he struggled were at Tennessee in that second half, and that's really the only game where he had like a significant amount of playing time. So, and then Georgia, the neutral site game, but obviously he went out of that one early. So, I mean, that'll be the question, right? Is all of Billy Napier's teams have struggled on the road, and you've got the schedule up here right now. You go at LSU, at Miami, then Texas, then at Texas A&M. I mean, I think if you were to ask me, pencil in wins and losses, I mean, you would say, okay, LSU, toss up. Miami, depends on what they do at quarterback. Texas, probably a loss. Texas A&M, toss up. Right, I think Texas A&M is going to be better this year than they were last year, based on what typically happens in a second year under a coach. So, the Long Island win and USF win to start things off, hopefully make things look pretty nice. But I think the big thing for me is that like last year when we did win, loss, and toss for our preseason magazine, Texas and Georgia were L's, and there was zero question about it. I at least have to think about it this year, right? Yeah. And I think that's kind of what you say when a team is like in that 15-20 range, and they're going to face a team that everybody thinks is going to be consensus top 5. You're not talking 95.5% in terms of it being a win for Texas. I think it's probably a lot closer than that. Is it 75-25? Is it 60-40? Is it 55-45? I think we'll learn a lot about how close that should be after those first 2 road games at LSU and at Miami, because that's a rough start. If you're looking to get off to a quick start, the first time you take real snaps against an SEC opponent is going to be on the road in Baton Rouge. That's an interesting road to hoe, and a little bit more difficult, I would say, than last year's schedule, even though you don't have to start out with Miami this year.
Yeah, SEC Mike, record of opponents, record of 2025 opponents in 2024. He threw this up today. So if you look for the 2025 schedule and relating it to the 2024 schedule, Florida's overall 90-66. Arkansas 106-53 for their opponents next year. That's brutal. So certainly, if you look at it like this, maybe as you said, Will, it was kind of more about where the games are going to be played, more so than the opponents. I mean, Florida here is right smack dab in the middle of the SEC when you look at trying to relate 2024 and 2025. Pretty interesting right here.
Yeah, I mean, so again, I think if you look at some of the teams, like Ole Miss and Alabama are great examples last year. I don't think either one of those. I think Ole Miss was probably closer to a great team than Alabama was, but Alabama's 3 losses all came on the road. Ole Miss, 2 of their 3 losses came on the road. Even if you looked at Oregon, who goes through the entire season undefeated, their biggest sort of close call to an inferior team was against Wisconsin on the road. And so those are the places where if you're going to make a playoff run, you're going to have to steal a game or 2 on the road. Now, Florida already has the neutral game against Georgia every year. And then, they've got the Miami and LSU games to start off the season, which, things can get ugly quickly, but things can be really, really advantageous in your favor at that point if everything goes well, right? If Florida comes out of the gate 4-0 with wins over Long Island, South Florida, LSU, and Miami, they can sustain a loss to Texas. They can sustain a loss at Texas A&M. Mississippi State, you probably put in the W category. Now you got Georgia, Kentucky, Ole Miss with a new quarterback, Tennessee with Nico, and then Florida State. There's a world here where getting above 6.5 is easy and done very, very early on in the season. But there's also a world where they're struggling to get to that place, especially, and this I think is, obviously Harrison Bailey coming in this week as a transfer is sort of a stopgap and an emergency in case Lagway goes down. But, the stat I keep hearing is, well, Florida was 6-0 when Lagway started and finished a game, all of which is true. But Lagway didn't start and finish every game he was out there, and that is a risk with any sort of player you've got, especially considering that Florida's probably going to need to run him a little bit in order to really sort of display the full offense. So, look, I don't think Florida has the the toughest schedule. Clearly, when you look at Arkansas, Mississippi State, and Kentucky, they sort of are above and beyond. But everybody else, until you get down to the Missouris and the Tennessees of the world, at least is playing a schedule that, based on 2024 win percentage, is roughly equivalent. But I think the road part matters. And then the other part that I think matters is we knew last year that somebody was going to come back to the pack. And Florida State came so far back to the pack that was just a joke. LSU came way back to the pack compared to where they were the year before. Miami, I think, took a jump up compared to where they were the year before, obviously. And so you start looking at that schedule last year and say, okay, like, some teams went up, some teams went down. I think we hit more of the up teams on the front end than we did on the back. Yeah. And I think that was the exact opposite of what we expected. I think we expected that the streak where it went Georgia, Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, Florida State was just going to be an absolute battleground. I think LSU was a little bit of a paper tiger. Florida State obviously was awful. The back end of that schedule ends up being a little bit easier. We'll see. I don't know what FSU is going to do this year. I don't expect them to be nearly as bad as they were in 2024. I don't expect them to be as good as they were in 2023. I think they're somewhere in between. But an 8-4 Noles team is still a dangerous team when you're playing a rival that last week into the season. You can't just – this year you could basically just roll the ball out. Florida was going to win. I don't know that you're going to be able to do that next year. And so – I think there's going to be an opportunity. Like LSU, I think will probably be a little bit better this year, though we'll talk about their quarterback situation. Miami, somebody in the chat reminded me Carson Beck's there, even though I said we'll see what they figure out at quarterback. See, I have a lot of confidence in guys coming back from Tommy John surgery who are going to be quarterback. I'm not necessarily sure Beck's going to be the guy there. Arch Manning at Texas. A&M going to have Marcel Reed there for a full year. Georgia, we'll see what they do at quarterback. I'm interested to see what happens there.
We were having this conversation in the Discord right before we went live here. Like, there's a lot of quarterback, not just for Florida schedule, quarterback questions, but just in the country too. Like Oregon, Ohio State, Georgia, you're Texas, we know Manning's the guy, but still there's a lot of for Florida's roster and the top of college football, a lot of quarterback questions.
Yeah. So I think, and you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, I have a working theory that I think the transfer portal isn't really having that big of an impact in most places, but the place that it's having an impact is it's essentially eliminating bad quarterback play at particular schools, right? That you're getting sort of average to above average quarterback play at a minimum. Because if a guy is at Tulsa and plays well, okay, he's going to have a spot at a Power 5 program. Or if a guy's sitting behind somebody at Georgia or Tennessee, like that guy has an opportunity to transfer someplace and provide above average play wherever he's going to go. So I think we're going to see that. What's going to happen, I think, is you look at like Ohio State. Ohio State out-talented everybody this year. And I don't think anybody really thinks Will Howard is like an NFL, he's not a can't-miss NFL prospect at quarterback. He wasn't really a difference maker at quarterback, at least until the playoff hit. He was a good quarterback, but not a great quarterback, but had great players around him. I think teams like Georgia, teams like Alabama, teams like Ohio State can get away with that. I think what we saw with the Notre Dame aspect of that game the other night is that when you have Riley Leonard at quarterback and you're limited and you don't have the same kind of talent around you, okay, now all of a sudden that starts to take hold. So Florida should have an advantage at quarterback in a lot of the different games that they come into. But obviously you're going to get a stinker or two every once in a while from a guy like Lagway, and that from a guy like anybody, right? There are just times where guys are going to struggle. We saw it in the second half against Tennessee. If the ask is for him to never struggle, I think as a true sophomore, we're going to be disappointed. What we're asking for is improvement. The question is, does that improvement put him in like the stratosphere of a Jackson Dart? Well, in that case, you're going to need things to go your way to make it into the playoff. You're going to need some luck. You're going to need some luck in one-score games. You're going to need Billy Napier to like find edges in terms of the coaching on a week-to-week basis. If it turns out that he's more like Kyler Murray in terms of his ability to improve, well, now you're talking about a guy who, as long as the defense is not LSU 2023 bad or Florida 2023 bad, you should have a team that easily waltzes into the playoffs. So, we can talk about everything. We'll talk about the defense. We'll talk about special teams. We'll talk about Napier and the play calling and all that stuff. But fundamentally, for the last 3 years, ever since DJ Lagway decided to come to Florida, that was the path for Napier to win SEC championships, national championships, and really placate the fan base. And I don't think that's changed. I think they still need to have a fundamental advantage at quarterback. I think they have an opportunity to do that, which is something I would not have said last year, right? Last year, coming into the year, one of the reasons I picked Florida to go 6-6 is because I didn't think they'd have an advantage at quarterback a lot of times, and I thought they'd have a talent disadvantage in a bunch of their games. I think that sort of proved to be true, and then, by the time we got to the second half of the year, Lagway comes in, the defense takes a step up, and Florida goes on a streak.
All right, keeping up with the rankings here. Let's go outside of Florida for a second and just looking. I mean, Florida, you got 12 games in the season, and about half of Florida's schedule is ranked, and among those, Texas, Georgia, LSU, Tennessee, Miami, Ole Miss, Texas A&M. And in these 5 rankings, all were ranked and except 2 of them, the On3 rankings in 24/7. On3 didn't have Ole Miss ranked, and 24/7 didn't have Texas A&M ranked. They were all ranked in the other one. So, in looking at it, took the average ranking, Will, just from these 5 rankings from ESPN, Athlon, On3, 24/7 Sports, and CBS Sports. Florida's average ranking was 14 in those 5. Texas, number 1 out of those 5. Georgia, number 4. When you take a look at it, of course, Ohio State, Oregon, among Texas and Georgia, with those schools up there a lot. Penn State was another school fighting there in the top 5. That was the schools that saw the most there. LSU with an average rank of 11. Tennessee, 12. Miami, the same as Florida at 14. And for Ole Miss and Texas A&M, I just added 30 for them to kind of get an average there since they were right outside the top 25. Ole Miss 22, Texas 23. So, as I said, and kind of going where some of those prognostications went when they were ranking Florida and looking at this, Florida's going to have another. I mean, when does Florida not ever have a tough schedule? I guess you could ask ourselves that, but certainly coming off of this year, 2024, playing that same schedule again in 2025, just flipping home and away, Florida's going to have another landmine-filled schedule here, and it's kind of at the top. You go have 3 teams about fighting for the top 10 in Texas, Georgia, LSU to start the season, and then, of course, Tennessee not far out. Miami getting Carson Beck, I think, alleviates some of the quarterback questions people had for them. If they were rolling in here with Emory Williams, I'm not even sure they would be ranked, but Carson Beck raises the profile of their quarterback room, of course. Ole Miss replacing a lot with Jackson Dart and Princely Umon Yellen and so many transfers not on that team now. Texas A&M second year Mike Elko, of course. So really, Will, besides FSU, pretty much the same teams you see here that were going to be, ranked in the 2024 schedule and the 2025 schedule for the Gators. But of course, still having to face teams at the top.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see what happens with Georgia. I think, Carson Beck was not very good last year. He was great 2 years ago. He was not good last year. And Georgia fundamentally was not a great team this year. They were 50th in yards per play allowed. They were 30th in yards per play, they were 30th in yards per play allowed, 50th in yards per play gained. So really, sort of.
And slow start after slow start after slow start for that team.
But even if you look at the advanced stats, if you look at EPA differential, they're sort of middle of the pack. They weren't the worst team in the SEC by any stretch.
No.
But if you actually start ranking them,
still won the SEC championship.
Still won the SEC championship, which is a testament to Kirby. But in terms of EPA differential, they're 6th or 7th overall, or were 6th or 7th overall. Now they're adding another just group of 5 stars, and the question is, are they able to reload? But honestly, 2024 was not the season I expected to be a reload for Georgia. They had a returning quarterback. They hadn't lost a ton in the draft on the defensive side. I mean, they'd lost some, but hadn't lost a ton in the draft. Like you said, inconsistent on offense ever since Monken left and went and turned Lamar into just an absolute star. I mean, he was winning MVPs anyway, but he's been even better the last couple of years. Ever since Monken left, the Georgia offense has been sort of stagnant. I'm really interested to see what happens this year and whether Georgia, the thing with Alabama that made them really impressive in the Saban era is that they were just able to continue it year after year after year after year after year. And you don't see that very often. I mean, maybe you could talk about the Bowden teams back with FSU. You could talk about the Nebraska teams under Tom Osborne. you could maybe talk about Oklahoma under Bob Stoops, certainly Florida under Spurrier, but really traditionally, even teams that have been great, like you think about the Miami teams back in like 2000 and 2001, where Larry Coker took over and the whole thing fell apart, or even the Florida teams in the early 2000s where you've got Urban Meyer coming in. Typically, these sort of rises and falls have been a little bit more unexpected, and so I was really surprised to see Georgia take the step back they did. Now, again, won the SEC championship and made the playoff, but I think the underlying stats suggest there might be some issues there. So I'm really interested to see what happens with Georgia as we head in. Maybe Kirby fixes the problem, gets a quarterback in there, and is able to turn things around on the defensive side of the ball. But maybe they remain vulnerable.
Yeah, and you talked about Florida being on the road last year. Take a look at Georgia, and their loss at Alabama, at Ole Miss. It was. The SEC on the road is really tough, and I think we really saw it when LSU coming into the swamp, Ole Miss coming into the swamp. I mean, you really saw teams when the top of the pack came a little closer and had to go on the road. You really saw it play out where it became pretty tough in this conference to go win on the road.
Well, and this is where Lagway makes such a big difference. Being able to hit those big plays to give yourself a lead, to get a leg up on the guy that you're on the team that you're playing. Like, the fact that LSU's pretty much had to play from behind the entire game. The fact that Ole Miss, I think they jumped up 14-7, but then in the second half, we're pretty much playing catch up almost the entire game. Like, being able to put the onus on the offense and make them press a little bit, and all of a sudden you got Jackson Dart on the sideline crying because he's throwing interception after interception. Those are all like the Florida defense did a great job in those games, but the explosiveness of the Florida offense is one of the things that sort of enabled them to pin their ears back and really get after the quarterback and do a lot of the things that they were able to do. So it's a symbiotic relationship there. And I think the elevation in quarterback play, and quite honestly, the elevation in the belief in the quarterback and his ability to turn the game in any given second is something that's hard to measure, but certainly something that we saw. So, not only did teams like Georgia and LSU and Ole Miss kind of come back to the pack a little bit, maybe, but I think also Florida, the last half of the season, was able to raise certainly able to raise their ceiling, but I think even more significantly able to raise their floor, right? That even when Florida was struggling, there was always the possibility of a lightning strike. And, you'd see them go 3, 4, 5 drives where nothing happens, and all of a sudden, bam. As opposed to what had happened previously the last couple of years and even the Tennessee game this year is maybe a perfect microcosm of that. You spend a lot of time driving all the way down the field. You make one mistake, and all of a sudden, you wasted your 7-play, 75-yard drive because you're not able to convert a fourth down, or you fumble the ball on a QB sneak, or you miss a field goal or whatever. That's not really the way that DJ Lagway operates. Lagway ends up, it's like, you're not getting anything, not getting anything, 7.
Yeah. if it's a touchdown drive and it's more than 5 plays, I'm like, what, huh? What's happening here?
Well, and again, I think that's sort of the next step for him, right?
Yeah.
The next step is what happens when the defense plays drop 8, what happens when they force Florida to do some things, but also he should be much more equipped to do it, not just because he's had an off season to look at the film and understand what the coach wants him to do and be able to exploit those coverages, but also because he's going to have the ability to run, which is not something that he had at all in the second half of the year. So I think there's like all these caveats associated with Florida. Lagway obviously has to take a step forward, but there's so many things to like about the way he played, in particular when you factor in that he was injured along the way, and then it was kind of a freak injury. It wasn't something where like his hamstring gave because he was just putting too much pressure on. His hamstring gave because the turf at Jacksonville's field just is terrible. So I don't think any of these rankings are out of line. I think we can all see a scenario where Florida finishes in the top 10 and ends up in the playoff. I think we can all see a scenario where Florida ends up in this 14 to 18 range and just misses the playoff, kind of like Ole Miss and South Carolina this year. I think there's a scenario where Florida has some bad luck early on, or maybe some bad play early on, especially on the road, get a couple of key injuries, and now you're talking about just trying to hold on to get over that over-under. I'm not sure there's any scenario where I see Florida getting in the top 5. And I think that's maybe there is a ceiling here for Florida in 2025. Maybe things fall right in the playoff and they end up getting to play SMU and Boise State and Penn State on the way to a championship game. But, again, given what we've had so far, if my biggest problem is trying to figure out where does Florida sit in the bracket, and can they get a good line in the bracket to the championship? If that's my biggest problem, we're having a damn good season, buddy. So.
For sure. I think Tennessee's that enigma team for me. I was higher on them coming into this past season. A lot of that was due to I thought Nico would be a lot better than he would be. He did not. Their defense really kind of carried him. Dylan Sampson at running back really carried him. Can Nico take that next step for Tennessee? A lot of love for Tennessee here in these rankings, hovering around that top 10. Can they repeat and make the college football playoff again? So, before we kind of move on here, we are going to learn a lot about Florida's opponents the first week of the season. Taking a look at the 2025 season openers. Texas at defending national champion. Well, not defending because you don't defend your title in college football. That's just a habit there. At the current national champions, Texas had Ohio State to kick off the season. Notre Dame at Miami. LSU at Clemson. Alabama at FSU. Syracuse versus Tennessee. A lot of these teams ranked right here that we were discussing, we're going to learn a lot about in week one. Now, you're not going to learn everything, of course. Florida got better after getting shellacked by Miami, so it doesn't make you. But for a team like LSU to start with Clemson and then have Florida a couple of weeks later, Miami having to play Notre Dame and having to play Florida a couple of weeks later. I mean, we're going to learn about Miami and LSU pretty quick when Florida's playing Long Island, Florida's playing USF. And these season openers here, I mean, looking at Florida's opponents, it's going to be interesting to see, that's going to be, if Florida's is good and lives up to this ranking here, that's going to be a tough start for LSU, a tough start for Miami.
Yeah, well, that cuts both ways, right? I mean, obviously, if Miami comes out of its opening game with a win, and if LSU comes out of its opening game with a win, not only do they have the momentum, but also they're probably really, really good teams that Florida's going to have to be up for and take down. I think if they lose that game, even if I'm a Miami or LSU fan, I can make the case that I'd rather lose that early game and then be prepared for the rest of the schedule as well. I think in many ways.
Well, we've seen that with Florida, in Billy Napier's first 3 years. Miami.
Only takes 4 games to get ready.
No, I'm just saying Utah, Miami. He's had that first game. This is the first year he's had a breather to start week one, and these teams are going out there and fighting for their lives week one.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think it can be a good thing or a bad thing. Obviously, 2017 against Michigan, sort of dive bomb Florida season there with Jim McElwain. It is entirely possible. And look, I mean, Florida State with Georgia Tech this year, right? They lose that one on a last-second field goal and never really recover from that along the way. So,
and sometimes the opener can be a good indication.
And you think about it, I mean, you've got the LSU USC game that I thought was like a battle of two titans, and it turns out it was sort of a battle of two middling teams in each conference. Yeah. So that's the other part of it is every year in college football we get a little bit surprised. Nobody would have picked Indiana to be in the top 10. I think maybe you would have picked Tennessee to be there. You certainly wouldn't have picked SMU to be there. Penn State has historically sort of been on the outside, and they were a little bit better this year. So, look, I think there's going to be some rise and fall and ebb and flow. I honestly, so I think given what we've seen with the history of Florida and Billy Napier, I'm glad that he's got a couple of cupcakes before they get into the meat of the schedule. At the same time, those cupcakes have kind of been a breather after a tough game, right? I mean, even the game against Utah in his opening season, they win that game and then come out and lay an egg against Kentucky. And I think that's one of the challenges that you run into in the SEC that you don't run into in some of these other conferences is those teams aren't as good as you in many cases when you play them. But if you've just come off of a game where you're getting beaten up, okay, well now it really does make a difference. And so, Florida had that weird stretch this past year where every time they played somebody, they were coming off a bye. And so those sorts of things do make a difference in the long term. It's one of the reasons why I think we all thought Florida was going to struggle on the back end of the schedule. I think 6.5 is aggressively low, right? I think given what Florida saw with DJ Lagway, if he can stay healthy all year, I think 6-5 is, and considering you got 4 of your 5 offensive linemen coming back, I think that's one of those things where you go, okay, if you're going to keep your quarterback healthy, this is the year you're going to keep him healthy. And if you think about the defense, you've got Banks and Sapp, sort of your two best players there as well, coming back. So, if you had to ask me today, I'd tell you I'm going to take the over. But really,
Same.
I think most Florida fans aren't going, ooh, 8-4.
Right.
I think Florida fans are going. I think there's a real argument. You and I even talked about a couple of weeks ago. I think there's a real argument of, is 9-3 good enough? 9-3 and 15th in the country. Like, is that good enough? Right. And a lot of it depends on what Lagway's doing. Like, if Lagway's just lighting it up left and right and they can't stop anybody on defense, okay, that's one narrative. If Lagway struggles and really doesn't take a step forward, and you still got Billy calling the plays, okay, that's another narrative.
We'll get into that conversation in a minute, but yeah.
And so I think
let me continue that. Maybe we discussed this or not. We did have that conversation about 9-3. Does it change the narrative if 9-3 reaches the playoff and 9-3 doesn't reach the playoff?
I mean, I'm not a fan of Mike White, so just making the playoff is not necessarily my goal. However,
but it would be for the first time.
Well,
and you think it would be, you think it would be a stepping stone to the next year.
So, look, if Billy Napier makes the playoff, it's good enough, because there's no way you're getting rid of a coach who made the playoff.
Oh, no.
Right? Like, so from is it good enough or is it not good enough? I think one of the things is that one of the things I'm trying to be honest about when I'm analyzing any team really is I don't know. There's not a lot of data associated with the transfer portal. There's not a lot of data associated with NIL. There's not a lot of data associated with the playoff, right? And so we can try to make some broad generalizations off of what we saw this year. And, I'll keep citing the fact that the teams that had the higher recruiting ranking are winning in the playoffs. But it's one playoff, right? And in some cases, that's because Ohio State was 2 spots ahead of Texas. It's like, okay, like that's really a toss up from a recruiting perspective. And so if I'm going to sit there and say, well, recruiting is definitely important because Ohio State won that game, it's like, okay, like,
right.
That's not really like in the long term. I think you could probably say that those teams are probably going to win 70-75% of the games, but one game doesn't necessarily, you're not necessarily always going to be able to pick that. Now, I do find it interesting that the one loss to a team that had a higher recruiting ranking was the team that lost its quarterback to the torn Tommy John ligament. And so Florida State fans lose the argument again with Jordan Travis being out. So that amuses me in some capacity. But nah, Dave, I mean, look, I think this is a 2-year window for Napier, regardless of what happens, unless it just tanks. Right. I mean, I even see a scenario where Florida goes 6-6. And it's like, well, we got to run it back. Like, we've come this far, right? And you and I may not feel that way. And the fact that we've probably lost based on like 3 times where we didn't have the right number of guys on the field might make us not feel that way. But
I think we know how the admin would approach it.
Well, and I think when you're the GM of an organization, like if you think about the NFL right now, like it's funny, 2 years ago, nobody wanted to be the general manager of the Washington Commanders. And now every single guy would take that job because you've got Jaden Daniels making like $1.2 million a year. And you got $120 million in cap space or something coming forward.
Yeah, let's take advantage of these next few years.
And so that fundamentally is what's actually happening here, and really what sort of is setting us up for the next 2 years. Now, look, I hope Napier succeeds. I hope he goes 11-1, 10-2, and we're not even having this debate, right? Because if he goes 11-1 next year with DJ Lagway, one, we're a real contender to win the national championship if you're going 11-1 in this conference. The other part of that is that means Lagway can carry you even when you don't necessarily get a perfect game out of your defense, which again is a real setup for 2026. As well as probably the offense gets a lot better with the 5-star wide receivers who are coming in, and potentially if you're going 11-1, you would hope Florida would be able to take advantage of that in the transfer portal, all those sorts of things, right? So, I mean, I don't know. It's all hypothetical at this point, but I agree, I guess, with the overall rankings. I'm just worried that overall ranking is 8-4. And we're sitting in Mike White land where we were like either right on the outskirts of the playoff or we just made it into the playoff. but then you get blown out in the first round, and you're like, okay, well, did we really take a step forward, or did we win a couple of one-score games, and that put us where we wanted to be? So
Yeah,
we'll
kind of like Tennessee in this past year. So we will get to the OC talk, but let's look forward to 2025 one more way, and that is Heisman odds. And I know Will loves this one. Just really, really surprised that one LSU quarterback, Garrett Nussmeier, is the leading Heisman odd favorite on FanDuel, tied with Arch Manning at the top. Cade Klubnik, Drew Aller is your next group, along with Nico Iamaleava, Jeremiah Smith as well. Then Lenore Sellers, Julian Sayin, Carson Beck, Dante Moore, DJ Lagway tied with John Napier, the Oklahoma quarterback transfer, of course. So there, Lagway grouped in about fifth, sixth, right there. Kevin Jennings from SMU, Austin Simmons, Miller Moss there at Louisville, Gunnar Stockton at Georgia, Ryan Williams, Marcel Reed, Jalen Daniels, and Steve Angeli there at Notre Dame. When just a little bit of time we saw him play when Riley Leonard went down, and then the Notre Dame quarterback gets into FanDuel's odds here. Talking about odd, Garrett Nussmeier leading the Heisman odds here for FanDuel. Of course, a lot of it from the Florida side is him coming to the Swamp and not leading LSU to a victory here. And DJ Lagway, of course, at home, getting that big win over LSU. A lot of the familiar names, of course, not going to be surprised with Arch Manning being up there, given his name. Whether you believe he's going to be up there or not, that name is going to have a lot of weight to it in these Heisman odds in Vegas. So, and of course, the name Manning, him at Texas, going to be surrounded by a lot of good players there. So you can certainly see it. Cade Klubnik there at Clemson, returning for another season. A lot of experience there on that. Drew Aller, of course, not ending on the highest of notes there. Was playing better up until that last performance there in the college football playoff. Nico, probably a lot higher than I personally would have him after what I saw this past season. of course, I know Jeremiah Smith is a wide receiver, but you tell me Nico and Jeremiah Smith have the same odds. The only way you can explain that to me is because Nico plays the quarterback position and Jeremiah Smith is a wide receiver. Lenore Sellers, South Carolina, getting a lot of love. Julian Sayin, the Ohio State quarterback, follows him. But Carson Beck there at Miami, and him tied with Dante Moore at plus 2,000 odds. Carson Beck, of course, now coming off that injury, the biggest question there. Will, I guess, get to that next grouping, John Mateer, DJ Lagway. Lagway slotted right. Now, I'd probably put him there right there with Lenore Sellers, probably with me. If I'm looking at this, I'd probably put him around that plus 1,800 odds there with Sellers is probably where I'd have him. And of course, I think he's going to get a lot of love. His name's going to be out there a lot. That certainly has an effect on how the public will go to Vegas and bet, I think. I'd probably have Lagway a little higher. Certainly, I wouldn't have Nico as high. So I'd probably Lagway, Nico, Sellers. I'd probably group those guys a little bit closer together.
Yeah, it's interesting. Nico, a couple years, it was either 2 years ago or last year, I wrote about his high school stats, and everybody always scoffs when I bring up high school stats. He wasn't that accurate in high school, and it turns out that transferred when he went to college. I think it's going to be a long road to hoe for him to get to have some giant jump. Now, that doesn't mean that he's not a good quarterback. Doesn't mean he can't be effective there at Tennessee. But a quarterback ranking of 145.3, only averaged 3.3 yards per rush. My stat, yards above replacement, he was slightly above average. And as a redshirt freshman, that's not necessarily terrible. But DJ Lagway was a much better player in 2024 than Nico was. The Nussmeier one is just completely inexcusable. It just is. And look, I get it. His dad has completely ruined me for the name, and I enjoy making the jokes, and that Nussmeiers can't win in the Swamp, and you can't trust a Nussmeier on offense and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, he averaged 7.7 yards per pass. He had a QB rating of 142.7, which is below average. My stat, yards above replacement, he was negative. So he was a below average quarterback by QB rating and by a QB metric that takes both running and passing into account. LSU was not a great team this year. And who are they adding that's going to like make them make some giant jump? And if Nussmeier or Manning are winning the Heisman, or Klubnik for that matter, those are going to be guys who like are playing on 11-1 teams, right? I mean, you see Hunter for Colorado doesn't need that, but he's playing on both sides of the ball. So unless Nussmeier is planning on playing linebacker, like how do I short that? Is there a way to short the plus 850? Like, can I? I mean, I get it. I mean,
well, and J-Rat earlier in the chat said, I think LSU will have a good year as well. Nussmeier, literally the same script as Burrow and Daniels. First year at LSU looks all right, then explodes the next year.
It's not even remotely close to what happened. So Joe Burrow in those last 4 or 5 years of that first year, so what was that, 2018?
Yeah,
in the last 4 games, took a giant leap. And the question going into, and I was paying attention to this because I had predicted that he was going to be great. And in that first year, I was like, oh, I'm going to have to eat some crow on this. And then the last 4 games, he was absolutely fantastic. Got knocked out in the game against Central Florida, but I think came back into that one. It was just great from the time he threw that pick 6 and lit everybody up. And then he comes out in 2019 and just absolutely destroys them. But if you look at the underlying statistics for Burrow, there was a lot of reason to believe that there was going to be a leap. I wrote an article about Kyle Trask back in 2020 where I looked at Burrow, why he made the leap, and sort of suggested that would be why Trask would make a leap, because you could see in sort of the underlying stats that, hey, he's typically more accurate than he was in 2018. And, at least if you look at his high school stats, he's more accurate than that. But his yards per pass is high. And so if he can get the accuracy up, all of a sudden you're talking about an elite signal caller. And actually, you can make that exact same argument with Lagway. Like Lagway in high school was a much more accurate passer, was down in like the 59% range, I think, this year overall. And if he can get that to 64 or 65, because he was averaging 10 yards to throw. So if you get him up to 64 or 65%, now he's going to be averaging 13 yards per throw. And that's like, elite of the elite of the elite. Nussmeier averaged 7.7 yards per throw and still completed more than 60% of his passes. So I'm looking at that going, okay, where does he go from there? And that's sort of the thing when you look at, so he completed 64% of his passes, 337 to 525. So what is he going to complete 72% of his passes? Like, we all watched that game against Florida where it was just dump off. And
that was a lot of the season.
There were opportunities down the field that he wasn't hitting. We talked about it before the game that he was bad throwing deep. Now, look, maybe he can improve that. But one of the things that's exciting to me about Lagway is that he's got the deep throw down, and now we got to figure out the intermediate stuff. For Nussmeier, you're asking him to do the opposite. I think that's a harder thing to do. Now, look, Mel Kiper has him as like the top 4 guys in the draft, or at least did coming into that Florida game, because I mentioned about 75 times during the broadcast.
Well, and going to your previous point, I don't mean to cut you off there, but kind of going to your previous point, and look, he's a better quarterback than Graham Mertz, but that's kind of what we were talking about with Graham Mertz this time a year ago is, hey, can he develop a touch for the deep ball? And then you saw Florida focus on it. You heard Florida focus on it. You saw Florida trying to do it versus Miami, and it just wasn't there. And some guys just don't develop it. Some guys just don't have it.
All right, so maybe what I need to do is look at LSU's over-under and just bang the under like nobody's business. Because if they think he's winning the Heisman, then the over-under's got to be like 9.5 wins.
8.5.
8.5? They're not winning 9 games and him winning the Heisman Trophy. There's no way. They got to win 11. And the other part is, and for everybody here who's heard me over the last year say, I think Graham Mertz is a good person. I think he's a pretty good quarterback. I don't think he's good enough with the talent he has around him. Nussmeier was worse this past year than Mertz was 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you look at QB rating, if you look at completion percentage, if you look at yards per attempt, if you look at yards above replacement, my stat, Mertz was better. And so now you got to sit there and say, okay, let's say he takes a step forward. Let's say he can be as good as Graham Mertz was for the first 5-6 games of this year before Mertz goes out with the ACL injury. Let's say Nussmeier can do that. Is the talent in LSU, given the schedule that they're going to have, really, really enough to where that guy's going to win the Heisman Trophy? I don't see it, man. Maybe I'm wrong, but you sent that to me knowing it was going to rile me up, and I'm just like, this is ridiculous. Like, but And here's what I'll say. It actually makes me feel good because quarterback play is a differentiator. And when the elite teams have elite quarterbacks, you have no shot. So, a couple of years ago when Alabama has Tua and Jalen Hurts, nobody had any shot, right? When Stetson Bennett was playing a really high level for Georgia, nobody had any shot. Even Milroe, who has been sort of up and down and especially is struggling against better teams, has made Alabama, if he's running the ball at all, Alabama becomes really, really difficult to beat. Think about Jackson Dart, who's been able to make Ole Miss a tough team to beat. But when you got the Will Howards of the world, who are good quarterbacks but not fantastic ones, you've got Garrett Nussmeyers of the world, who, below average to average. When you've got those guys at the top of a Heisman list, it makes me feel really good about having DJ Lagway at the top of my program, not necessarily because he's going to win the Heisman Trophy, but because it suggests that Florida has a path to having the best quarterback on the field every time they take the field, and that's an exciting thing, right? I mean
Drew Aller and Nico are tied for the second highest odds.
I mean, did the people who put this up there actually watch football this year? That list is just fascinating. Just fascinating. And look, there are some guys on there who are going to take a step forward. There are going to be some guys who come in who have different skills, take a leap, those sorts of things.
Jeremiah Smith's at the top of mine.
I can't believe he's not the number one. I just can't believe it.
He would be my top.
The guy would be the number one pick in the draft if he came out right now.
Yeah.
Right. So, unless he gets fat and happy and just decides I'm going to coast because I don't want to get hurt before I go to the NFL. But honestly, that should sort of go away now that we've got NIL. Heck, there's a bunch of guys. I saw something the other day. Carson Beck's making more at Miami than some of than Brock Purdy is for the Niners and
Daniels at Washington. I mean, since you just brought him up,
on a per year basis, right.
But
Daniels has more guaranteed, but
yes,
but still, that is a ridiculous list. That is all I will say. It is a ridiculous list that either, if based in reality, makes me feel really good about Florida, or just it's awful and we need to find.
And it goes back to the point I made earlier about just quarterbacks. There's a lot of teams have questions at quarterbacks, and if Lagway does take the steps that we think he can take, then Florida. And kind of going to your point that you made is Florida may be taking the field with the best quarterback on the field.
Well,
and
so I don't even think we have to say may there. He completed 59.8% of his passes, 10 yards per pass. His QB rating was 154.9, and his yards above replacement was 1.65. So yards above replacement is designed where 0 is average, 1 is good, 2 is elite. So he was somewhere between good and elite this year. And QB rating at 154.9 is kind of there too. Average is usually 146, 147. And if I look at where that sits in terms of QB rating, it's second overall in the SEC behind Jackson Dart. And so
do you I don't know if you have it available or not. So I don't mean to spring this on you. What was Cam Ward? Do you
for QB rating? I'd have to look it up.
Your yards above replacement.
Yeah, I don't have it on me.
That's what I figured. Yeah,
but I mean, it was good.
Yeah.
Because he was averaging something like 9 or 10 yards per throw.
Yeah.
And really, the whole idea of yards, it's an efficiency stat. What you're trying to do is parse. So I've done a lot of work that's sort of recognized that that yards per play is more important than a lot of other things. And so when a quarterback takes a sack, that's a negative play. And we see this all the time, right? Quarterback takes a sack on first down. It's now 2nd and 14, 2nd and 15. The drive's over. Right. It takes a special player to be able to get out of that situation. And so Ward, let's see 9.5 yards per attempt, QB rating of 172.2. And then he ran for 3.4 yards per attempt. He'd be up over 2.
Yeah.
Okay. He'd be up over 2. And 2 is sort of that limit. If you're sitting at 2.01, you're in the talk for the Heisman, but you're probably not winning it. The best ever, you're sitting at 4.5. Those are the Jaden Daniels, the Michael Vicks, the Kyler Murrays, the Baker Mayfields. I think Baker was at 3.5. Now you're starting to average 10.5, 11.5 yards per attempt. And if you're averaging a first down every time you throw the ball, your offense is moving.
For sure. Let's get into. I didn't mean to save it for this late, but Will and I we'll get talking here, and a good thing. But I know the polarizing topic of late last week was Billy Napier coming out 24/7 Sports interview with them. Those guys. Billy Napier kind of confirming that he's still going to be the play caller. And I don't think that has anything to do with the 6.5 win total that was thrown out there. I know many people want to make that connection, but I don't think so. But Napier calling plays. And well, let's take a look at it from both angles here. And I think the most popular side of this is Napier, the most popular side of Napier needing an OC for one reason or another. And I think there's some degrees to that thought. Some just think to take play calling off of his plate so he can be more of a CEO, a better game day manager. Some are fine with that. Some are mostly fine with the offense, the play calls, but not fans of the other stuff that seems to fall by the wayside. And there's another layer to that, and it's thinking that the offense is fine, but Napier doesn't have a great feel as a play caller. The flow of the offense isn't the best, that it's inconsistent, play calls in certain situations, not successful on third down, the middle 8, relying on 2 tight ends too much, not using wide receivers enough, relying on 2-man routes too much, when he is looking to throw the wide receivers. All those are aspects, of course, that we hear a whole lot of, just of the offense just not being there. And it's just not ran right with Billy Napier. The offense is good, just not ran by Billy Napier. So that's another layer to it. And then even further, some just plain hate this offense. They hate Napier calling the plays and just want something completely new. So now the other side of it, the offense has been good. I think there is truth in that. I think there's some good to this offense, but not great. Go back to year 1, Anthony Richardson at quarterback, inconsistent, but a very explosive offense. Year 2, you bring in Graham Mertz, have him play his best season of football as a quarterback. The offense is good, not great, not very explosive at all. Then, of course, year 3. We get here to year 3. That starts off as a disaster. Mertz gets hurt, opening the door for Lagway to play more, to eventually take over after another Mertz injury. We see the flashes of Lagway, but he's playing injured when he's on the field a majority of his starts. The offense tanks with Aiden Warner at quarterback. All the injuries lead to inconsistency at quarterback, but you can see the potential. So all these years were good. A good run game to lean on for the most part. Certainly not at the same level in year 1 where a lot of stats you see for the run game were borderline elite. But it's just been good the last couple of seasons as far as the run game goes. So, and taking all of this into account, the other side of the coin is Napier just kind of wanting to retain play calling duties and keeping with the continuity with a young Lagway, being able to call the plays with a level of quarterback that he's never had the chance to develop until now. So I think at bare minimum, I think the offense takes a jump next season with a more seasoned Lagway just on its own. And I can see Napier thinking that he could be a big reason for that and why he wants to call plays. He believes in his offense. He said he feels like he gets the best feel for his team in that role. And I do feel like with Napier still calling plays that if the offense is going to reach its full potential, then Napier's going to have to adapt, do some things we haven't seen yet to open up this offense. Plays, and I think when I look at it, Will, the plays just kind of seem like they're on hard mode. Like they may work, but it just never really looks easy. It never seems easy unless it's that explosive play action pass down the field that even that gets predictable at times when it's going to be called. So can Billy Napier do that? Is there a way he can get more out of the offense where the margin for error isn't so thin? And I'm mainly talking pass game there. I like what Napier schemes up in the run game, but the passing game rarely blows me away at that same level. Not many open wide receivers that, I'm watching the national championship game and I tweeted it. Ohio State has got wide receivers wide open. I mean, they're just wide open. There ain't nobody near them. Notre Dame's a good defense. There's nobody around those receivers. I don't see that in this passing game. So can he adapt? Can he show some different things in this scheme? I'm all for the offensive continuity, but there is more to unlock with this dynamic quarterback you have, that he's got now more experience, being able to lean on him to open up the offense. Or is it just going to be the same thing we have seen? Lagway will make it better, but I think with Napier, there's a ceiling. So I've been on the go get an OC, more for helping out in the other areas, more so than I have the offense stinks. I do think Napier can lead a good offense, but I don't think overall that's going to be good enough. I think you have Lagway. It needs to be elite. I'm not sure the defense still takes the necessary steps to be where Florida needs it. So the offense may have to be elite to get where we all want this team and program to go. And I believe it's probably another play caller to get to that level. So I will say from Napier's eyes, I can see why he wants to do it. I have my guy. Let me see what I believe in can work with him. It would be hard for me to give that up as well. If I'm Billy Napier, I will have my doubts, if it isn't good enough this time next year that he'd make a change then. But in that scenario, if you're honest with yourself, you gave it a shot, but you end up being the one holding the quarterback back and the offense back. Then with his last season, with Lagway's last season, that might be your last chance. Turn over the reins to a play caller. What I do think we are getting here is a clearer picture if Napier can be the play caller. Because with Lagway, to me, there's no excuse. If it doesn't work with Lagway, it's never going to work. So I think at this point, he's going to need to be honest with himself at that point. If we're looking at this a year from now, you have your guy, go do something with it. And I know many of you think you already have your answer and he won't take advantage of Lagway, but I do think at least we will get our full answer. I do think we will get to see it. I hope it doesn't cost Florida in the process.
That's awesome. Here.
Look, if I'm in his shoes, I'll probably do the same thing. And I don't chalk it up to arrogance, but maybe more ignorance.
I mean, I don't know that it's either one of those. So here's where I'll start. Schematically, Billy Napier's offense is fine. He runs a lot of the stuff that everybody else in the country runs. I don't think there's anything like groundbreaking about it, but I don't think there's anything that's flawed with it, right? I think if you have a quarterback and if you have the players who can execute it, then this offense is going to be just fine. But I think that's where the issue comes, right? Is that in order to win the SEC, even when you've got the most talented team, you have to get a little bit lucky. So like you think about Florida and the cock block back in 2006, had to get a little bit lucky. You think about the 2008 team, probably less lucky than the 2006 team, but still, like you look at any team this year, like Ohio State loses to Michigan and somehow sort of falls into the bracket. I mean, they wound up taking out everybody in the bracket because they fell out. But 2 years ago, you don't win the national championship that way. Certainly, they made the change to Chip Kelly, and it kind of clicked by the time they got to the playoffs. But even like you think about like the Alabama teams with Terrence Cody early on and a block against Tennessee, or you think
you said Florida in 08, but you had to overcome an Ole Miss loss. You had a loss. So, it wasn't guaranteed back then if you had one loss that you were making the BCS title game.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess my point is that if you have a team that's even a really, really talented team, you almost always have to have some level of luck. Like, again, think about Georgia a couple of years ago where the ball's dropping and Ohio State kind of goes into a shell and pulls a field goal left. And that would have knocked Georgia out of the playoff. And then they go and I think destroy TCU the next week to win the national championship. So you need a little bit of luck. And I think especially when you're a team that's not as talented as everybody else, you're going to need a little bit of luck. And so what I think you want to do with any sort of program is you want to give yourself an edge everywhere, right? And it's either we build ourselves up step by step by finding an edge in every single thing that we're doing, and the collective value of those edges is something that puts us in every game, or it's death by paper cut, right? Where we lose an edge in each of these different areas. And all of a sudden now you're losing games that you shouldn't because the collective sum of those things where you haven't found an edge is actually hurting you. And that's my concern with him not having an offensive coordinator is, hey, is the special teams going to have everybody out on the team and have full focus? Is the game plan going to be exactly what it needs to be? Are we going to run out of the pistol 70% of the time? And have that sort of tendency where if you've got the running back behind there. Now, look, some of the explosives come from that, right? Because you run a play action and everybody's crashing because you have that tendency. But do you know when to take advantage of it? And then the other part is just, if Ohio State could have gotten a lot of offensive coordinators, but getting Chip Kelly is a major win. So that's the other part, is what's the upgrade, right? Can you find someone who's an upgrade in that particular space? Part of me admires Billy Napier for sticking to his guns. I wrote this in last year's preseason magazine, where
I remember this, so I was.
It's like he's gonna live and die by himself, and in some capacity, I admire it. But in other capacities, I look at it and go, at some point, you have to change approaches. At some point, you got to decide when you're going to change. Now, we've already talked extensively tonight. He's got 2 years. As long as the wheels don't fall off, he's got 2 years. And so, I worry that you're wasting a year by not making the change now. But, again, it's sort of like, I was pretty vocal. I thought Florida should have made a change at coach this year. Especially early on with some of the returns that came, and you can argue with me, and I'd agree. I would understand the point you're making after seeing what happened the second half of the year. At the same time, I think both the people who go, you jumped the gun too early, and me going, I still have my doubts. I think both entities come in going, but we need to see something different. Right? Like, it can't be this. You can't run the same thing out there again, because you're going to go 7-5 again. Right? If you do the exact same thing and just say, well, DJ Lagway is going to solve everything.
Right. There you go. And that's my point. There has to be a realization that you were the one holding it back. Now, I can understand, like, you got that new toy, and you've been waiting for a quarterback like DJ Lagway ever since you started coaching, and you have that guy. I don't blame him for not wanting to coach that guy and coordinate the offense around that guy.
It's an interesting thing.
But if it doesn't work, you got to be able to realize it is time to turn the page before it's too late.
So if Billy Napier wins a national championship with DJ Lagway, does anyone care who the offensive coordinator is?
No.
You're talking about this like
that's part of everybody's argument here, though, is there's not many head coach OCs that are going to win a national championship.
Well, and no one is sitting there and saying, well, Ryan Day's national championship is cheapened because he's got Chip Kelly as the offensive coordinator. I think the state of college football enabled Ohio State to hire a guy as the offensive coordinator who is extraordinarily qualified to be an offensive coordinator. But Florida could have done that last year. Florida could have gone and offered Chip Kelly a bigger deal than he got at Ohio State. And maybe Chip Kelly comes to Gainesville and all of a sudden we're having a different discussion. Again, that's an edge, right? Ryan Day decided he could get an edge by having Chip Kelly on his staff. I don't begrudge Kelly leaving the job he had at UCLA and going to take that job. He wants to coach football. He doesn't want to deal with the recruiting and the NIL and all that sort of stuff. There are other coaches who feel that way too. And so go get those guys, right? like bring those guys in. But
going to my one point about the can a head coach be an offensive coordinator and win a title? I don't think that automatically disqualifies you. Like, I think Steve Sarkisian in Texas's offense is as good as that is because of him.
Close.
but because of him, right? They're getting pretty close. They're in that spot because of him. When Lincoln Riley was dominating in Oklahoma, they were there because of him, not in spite of him. And so they were in that situation to me because of those guys in the first place. So I'm not willing to disqualify. Look, I agree. I think it is a lot harder to do it. But here's the thing: if you are a head coach that calls plays, you better be elite at it. Because that's what those guys are. They are elite at it, and they're still a little short of winning a title. Your Lincoln Riley and your Sarkisians, but they were there because of those guys. So I think it's a fine line there.
Well, let me ask you a question then, because the Lincoln Riley comparison is actually pretty good, right? So he had some unbelievable quarterbacks there at Oklahoma. And then he goes to USC and he's got Caleb Williams for 2 years. And he doesn't have a star at quarterback anymore. And his offense doesn't look that great. Right? Like, in some capacity, are we grading Lincoln Riley on a curve and going, he's a great offensive head coach because he happened to have elite quarterbacks for an extended period of time? And granted, he went through more than one over the course of that time, right? At the same time, Spencer Rattler had a great year and then fell apart the year after.
I was going to give him a little bit of credit, too, for making Spencer Rattler actually look kind of good. So,
again, this is sort of where I go, is that 3 years ago, the narrative was Lincoln Riley is a great offensive coach and he can do it while he's the head coach. And now you look at him at USC and you go, if I was a Trojan fan, I'd be sitting there going, I'd be okay if you brought in an offensive coordinator or somebody to help. Like that'd be okay. And has he been buttressed by having unbelievable quarterbacks? And I think Klubnik being there on the Heisman list is hilarious from the standpoint of, he's been disappointing for a 5-star recruit at that position for Clemson. But I always talk about 5-star recruits being a 75% proposition to deliver. Dabo's hit on every guy he's brought in at quarterback. It's like he made a deal with the devil at some point and just bam, bam, bam. Taj Boyd, Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence, and now Klubnik and DJ Uiagalelei come in and he hasn't hit on those guys. And we've seen what's happened to Clemson, and the Clemson offense has been sort of and it's come back to the pack. So I do see the point that, like, if I were in Napier's living room and he was talking to me about it, I'd completely understand the point that, look, an elite quarterback is where you get an elite offense. And, you can paper over holes. Like Dan Mullen was able to paper over some holes with Felipe Franks, but he wasn't winning national championships with Felipe Franks at quarterback. I think Lincoln Riley might be able to paper over some holes with Miller Moss, but he's not winning national championships. I think potentially, Brian Kelly and his staff there might be able to paper over some holes with Garrett Nussmeier. I don't think you're winning a national championship with Nussmeier at quarterback. I think Lagway is one of those guys where you look at it and go, he's a national championship caliber quarterback if he develops at all. And, I would not be surprised if Florida's offense is either elite or borderline elite this year. But I still go back to what I said about building edges. And so unless you bring something, so Napier's scheme isn't bad, but unless you bring something differentiated to the table, like why not delegate that to someone else? Right? Why not gain an edge someplace else? Because I think they're the number of timeouts that are wasted because the play clock's running down, the number of goofy decisions that are made at the end of the half in terms of the way they want to actually move the ball up and down the field, all the ridiculous penalties that happen in terms of number of guys on the field, having to bring a mat with 10 spots for special teams on the road, those things. I mean, we laugh about them in some respects, but those are the things that lose you games. And, there's not going to be, well, again, I don't know that it matters. That's the thing, Dave, is that if it doesn't work out this year, he's going to get 2026 to do it as well. And then we'll all be talking about the new offensive coordinator in 2026. So, hey, if you're Napier, you say, let me do it my way in 2025. And then in 2026, I'll bring somebody in if it doesn't work out. And it doesn't, I mean, we can sit here and disagree with it all we want. Doesn't really matter. It is the way it is, right? It's the same thing. I thought Florida needed to make some changes when it came to the staff. They didn't do it. I've come to accept that. I understand what it is. And I'm not necessarily expecting Florida's staff to look for all these little edges. Really, I mean, you and I were so frustrated during the season when DJ Lagway was playing every 3 drives. And, unfortunately, it required an injury. But if that injury hadn't happened to Mertz, what would we be saying right now?
Yeah.
Where would we be? Even if Florida had pulled off the 4 wins to end the year, what would we be hanging our hat on? What we're really hanging our hat on is a quarterback who played at an elite level, or at least between good and great, depending upon how you want to define it, in his first sniff at SEC football. And the 3 years or 2 years that are coming up after that, that's where we're hanging our hat. Again, it was pretty obvious when we were watching him on the field that Lagway was going to throw some interceptions, that Lagway was going to have some growing pains. But man, it was different when he was on the field. And honestly, that if somebody is going to be sort of hit or miss, having them play 1 out of every 3 drives is the worst way to implement them. Because, if you're only going to get 3 drives a game and you're inconsistent, it's entirely possible those 3 drives will produce nothing and give you, 3 punts. Whereas if you give the guy 9 drives, 3, 4, 5 of those drives end up in touchdowns because you're able to hit the big plays. And that's what we saw against Samford. That's what we saw against Kentucky. In some ways, that's what we saw against LSU and Ole Miss as well, to a lesser degree, but that Lagway would go through these spells where nothing was happening. And then all of a sudden, bam, Florida's going down the field. And sort of the way they facilitated the quarterbacks early in the year was something that, again, how do you give yourself an edge, right?
Yeah.
Like what are you doing to give yourself the best chance to win? And look, Billy Napier's got to win some games. That's what it comes down to. You can't go 4-8 and say it's a development year. You're going to actually have to win some games. So we'll see, man.
Yeah, I think the biggest worry for most out there is that it just turns out that he's holding this offense back with Lagway. That it just doesn't take that step. Like, it's going to take a step with Lagway. To me, it is going to. In year 2, he's that good. The offense is going to take a step. Is there another step with an offensive coordinator change?
Well, I mean, so it's interesting. I did go back and look at the yards per play for all the playoff teams. And Clemson was 39 in offense, 54 in defense. That's kind of where Florida was this year. So against an ACC schedule, Florida might have a shot to win the ACC. Texas was 24th in offense, 2nd in defense. Tennessee was 55 on offense, 7th on defense. Ohio State was 4th on offense and 1st on defense. SMU 42nd and 9th. Penn State 8th and 6th. Indiana 35th and 3rd. Notre Dame 15th and 5th. Arizona State 30 and 37, Oregon 14 and 26, Boise State 10 and 56, and Georgia 50 and 30. So if you're talking about who advanced deep into the playoff, they were teams that had an elite unit on one side of the ball. Like Texas, 2nd on defense. Ohio State, 1st on defense. Penn State, 6th on defense. Notre Dame, 5th on defense. Now, certainly, look, Notre Dame supplemented with the 15th ranked offense. Penn State supplemented with the 8th ranked offense. Ohio State supplemented with the 4th ranked offense. And if you wonder why Ohio State beat Texas, Texas is at the 24th ranked offense. And I've been clamoring all year long for Texas to bring in Manning. I was basically looking at Ewers and going, this is like he's like he's a better version of Kelly Bryant. And you might have Trevor Lawrence sitting on the sideline, but you don't know until you play him. And Manning, when he was in there, was really, really good. And all season long, I was sitting there looking at it going, geez, if they just put Manning in, they might be able to win this thing, because it was the offense that was holding them back all year long. So my worry is I don't think Florida's going to have an elite defense next year. I think their defense will be good. I think their defense will be opportunistic. But I don't think Florida's going to have the 2nd-ranked defense in the country.
Nope.
And if my supposition from this one playoff is that especially in the SEC, you're going to have an elite unit on one side of the ball or the other, then the best chance for Florida to have that is on the offensive side of the ball. And so if Billy Napier, being the play caller, makes them the 12th ranked offense instead of the 2nd ranked offense, that's an edge that would have helped you. And there's going to come a time where you fall behind by a couple of touchdowns, or you have a turnover, or, just everything's going wrong. It's like the Madden game where the computer doesn't want you to win and just everything's going wrong. And the question is going to be, can you turn it around, and can you get it to can you pull out that game by a field goal late? Like, you think about Washington a couple of years ago. Washington was something like 8-0 or 9-0 one-score games, and against inferior opponents. But Michael Penix was able to go pull those things out. And DeBoer this year, his luck ran out in those one-score games, and all of a sudden now Alabama, there's a lot of people wondering whether he's the right fit for that program. So again, I admire Billy Napier's chutzpah for essentially, I mean, the conversation was around the vote of confidence for Scott Strickland. The assumption was that there was an offensive coordinator. It sort of implied, and that sort of came along with the vote of confidence. But
I think that's why a lot of people were perturbed by this as well, is because it was talked about so much. And I kept saying, I'll believe it when I see it. Even though I was hearing there was a change possibly being made, I said on this podcast many a time, I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, and again, I mean, look, you don't make $7 million a year and get to the position of being a head coach at a major SEC program without believing in what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so,
and you deserve a chance to make it and see it work.
Okay.
No, but I'm saying we may have already reached that point.
Well, I mean, so yes, I think that there is. I have opinions on that, but I'm not. Again,
dance with what got you here.
My opinion, well, what got him here? This offense didn't exactly work at Clemson before he had elite quarterbacks, right? Maybe that's the thing. Maybe he's just ruining the fact that he never got Taj Boyd or Trevor Lawrence or Deshaun Watson. And he's like, I could have done that at Clemson if I'd have had that guy, and now he's got that guy. And look, maybe DJ Lagway wants him to call plays. I have no idea. Like, it turns out that, I mean, Lagway sort of.
I know there is something there with that. Yes, he does like it.
And there's a comfort level with that, but it's interesting. I think sometimes when your boss is like, you shouldn't always want to hear from your boss, right? like if your boss is always nice to you, chances are he's not getting everything he can out of you. And so that's the question in the relationship that I have is just because Lagway's comfortable, like a lot of times growth comes from being uncomfortable. And so I would say that for both Napier and Lagway is that sometimes growth comes from being uncomfortable. An offensive coordinator in the room has an opportunity to make you a little bit uncomfortable, maybe think you outside the box, and quite honestly, maybe game plan for some of it. Was really interesting in that championship game, the throwback to Jeremiah Smith for the touchdown. I can't remember who it was on Twitter, but somebody basically posted Alabama doing that to Ohio State a couple years ago. And it's like, oh, Chip Kelly learned. Chip Kelly looked at the film, found something during the offseason, and kind of held on to it until a time when he thought he needed it and had time to do the install and all that sort of stuff, right? But you're talking about their wide receivers being wide open. Nobody was more open than Jeremiah Smith on that one. And I mean, if you're Notre Dame, I mean, doesn't your defensive game plan start and stop with make sure we've got two guys on Jeremiah Smith? And the motion and the scheme and all that stuff just got him wide open. And again, to your point, I'm not sure we necessarily see that all the time. But I mean, it is what it is, man. We can sit here and we can talk about it, and we can complain about it, and we can say we should do something else. But one, we're not gonna be able to prove a negative, right? If Florida's offense ends up top 10 in the country, we're not gonna be able to say, well, it would have been 3 with an offensive coordinator. Like you're just not gonna be able to do that. Now, if Florida's offense ends up 45th, one, we got problems, but two, now you're right in the Napier zone. I mean, he's been right between 45th and 55th in yards per play every year he's been here, whether it was with an explosive player like Anthony Richardson, whether it was with a game manager maybe like Graham Mertz, or whether it was an explosive player in DJ Lagway for half the year last year. They were much higher in the yards per play with Lagway in there than they were with Mertz or with Warner. At the same time, if he ends up in that sort of Napier zone between 45th and 55th, we're on the outside looking in. I mean, I don't think it's a bad team, but I don't think it's a team we're going to write home about and say, remember when Florida broke through. And that's the question, right? The question with the offensive coordinator for me is not, can Florida beat its over under? The question with the offensive coordinator for me is, do you have a chance at a national championship? And do you give yourself a better chance if you bring somebody in? I think most people agree that you do, but Napier doesn't, and he's the only one who matters.
Yep. So, I mean, most of this has already been said, in when the OC talk came up last year. But now the quarterback is different, and we'll see if that changes what we think and expect can happen. But there we go. So, man, fun-filled episode here.
Yeah, man. I hate to end it on that note. Sort of
we saved it for last anyway, so it was just going to be the way it ended.
I don't know, man. I don't like. I wish there were like. I really appreciated that they hired a general manager last year. I thought that was a good step forward. The fact that it sounds like they're going through the motions of going through motions, the wrong word. Going through that they're going through interview processes for bringing in front office type NFL type executive folks to help in the front office, I think is a big deal. Again, edges, right? Like I want Florida to find every single edge, and that, I don't want Florida to finish 5th in recruiting. I don't want Florida to finish 5th in the SEC in offense. I don't want them to finish 5th in the SEC in defense. And I want them to have the most front end, forward-thinking departments in all of college football to take advantage of all the little things. And when you don't control the things you can control, those are the things that I think get people's ire, is that, you can control a lot of the things that have caused issues over the last few years, but again, it's year 4. We'll see how it goes. I'm pretty sure we're getting year 4 and year 5. So it's a 2-year package to see what we got. And we got the most exciting player. We've got a really exciting player at the most important position on the field. And so, if nothing else, there's an enormous amount of optimism because of that, regardless of who's calling plays.
Yep. It's kind of a running joke on Discord. It's like, you can throw out complaints and criticisms, but end it with "but Lagway," and you're all good. So, but yeah, good stuff there. But yeah, I mean, lots to look forward to. Florida being ranked, as I say, it's the first time we've been able to discuss that after a season in the way too early rankings for the next season. Florida firmly in every poll I've seen out. Like I said, I only shared 5. I think there was like 8, 9 of them out there that I saw. Florida's ranked in every one of them. So certainly good to be on that, trending in the right direction, and now just setting it up to take that next step. And all the OC talk goes hand in hand with that, I guess. So
I'm really fascinated. We always do that episode in May where you read off the opposing coaches' comments.
Yes.
I'm fascinated to hear what the opposing coaches have to say about this Gators team this offseason. I think
it's so funny. I was going to read last year's on tonight's episodes. I was like, I went back and read them, and it didn't really blow me away with anything. It was just like, it doesn't really. Not earth shattering, but
the question that I have is more process oriented type stuff, right? Like, do people look at it and say, like, do we hear coaches going, "I'm surprised they don't have an offensive coordinator," or is it just Lagway is special if they can? I mean, anybody can say that, right? Lagway's special if they can get him to take the next step. Those sorts of things. But I'm really curious to see what some of those guys think.
Yeah, because I will go back and I remember there was one coach that said changes needed to be made on the defensive side of the ball with the coaches because it was basically a discombobulated mess on that side of the ball. So that one that was really about the only thing going back and looking at this past preseason magazine and what coaches were saying, and then kind of seeing what played out with Corey Raymond gone, Sean Spencer gone, the new coaches in, an improvement toward the end of the season. But everything else was, not really worth the note. But
yeah, I mean, look, obviously, we have our concerns and our criticisms, but Carson Beck is not our quarterback, and we're not paying him $4 million a year to be our quarterback. I think we're in a place that's better than, and we're not Florida State. Who did they bring in somebody through the transfer portal at quarterback?
Yeah, Castellanos.
They brought in the guy from Boston College.
Mm-hmm.
So
with Gus Malzahn, who got rid of Castellanos earlier in his career.
So I guess the statement would be, I feel way better being us than them, and We're now talking about how do we go from being a winning program to a championship program. That's a cool discussion to have. And certainly, look, I mean, Ohio State, when they lost to Michigan, everybody's ready to fire Ryan Day. So it's not as though emotional college football fans don't necessarily go past their skis from time to time. But it's going to be fascinating, man. Fascinating.
For sure. All right, that'll do it for this episode of Gators Breakdown. Check out Will Miles at Will Miles STC and at Read and Reaction. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on social media at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thank you for joining us on this episode of Gators Breakdown.